This is a re-recording of the second hour, What is God Like? There was an audio issue with the original recording, and therefore we'll pick this up in the second hour of that class. Now, before we get into the texts that we're going to cover, texts like the offering of Isaac and the flood and the conquest of Canaan, there has to be at least a little bit of an admission that this is a difficult text. First, we're going to deal with the offering of Isaac, but all of these are in some ways difficult texts. Now, specifically here, if I was to hear today that someone killed their child and claimed that God told them to do it, I would outright dismiss their claim that God had told them to do that. And yet here, when we deal with the biblical text, when we deal with Genesis, I don't dismiss the idea that God commanded Abraham to offer his son as a burnt offering. And why? Why do I make that distinction? God's command was to Abraham. The command is found in Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 19. And this text sounds absolutely horrible to our Western modern ears. This is tantamount to child abuse. It's murder or human sacrifice, and it's desecration of a corpse. So yes, what's being talked about sounds horrific, and I want to say that up front. But as we lay down groundwork in hour one, we do have to allow all of the relevant texts to speak to this issue. And I'm going to just say up front, Genesis 22 cannot be divorced from the rest of the story, especially from the rest of the Genesis narrative, from the Abrahamic narrative, and we have to read it in its context. Now, again, the offering of Isaac is Genesis chapter 22, keeping in mind that the chapter breaks were added much later than the original composition of the text. The Abrahamic narrative really begins with Genesis chapter 12, and we'll come to that more a little bit later. But Genesis chapter 12, I believe the author assumes that before you get to what we call 22, the section that we identify as chapter 22, you've already read chapter 12. You already know what has happened before this episode in 22. And that will inform your understanding of 22. We'll get into that a little bit more. We also have to keep in mind chapter 15, verse 4, that the child of promise would come from Abraham's own body. Chapter 15 is where God and Abraham have a conversation. And although Abraham acknowledges that God has indeed blessed him, he points out that he doesn't have an heir to inherit that blessing. And God says that a child from his body, from Abraham's body, will be his heir. Chapter 16, the birth of Ishmael. And the birth of Ishmael is an important text regarding chapter 22 and regarding the entirety of Scripture. And one thing is, once again, by the time you get to what we call 22, you've already read the rest of the story. And you should be hearing themes. You should be hearing and noticing certain things are kind of repeating themselves in certain ways that you should pick up. You should realize, wait a minute, this text is similar to what I've already read. Chapter 16, verse 3, Sarai, her name would be changed later, Sarai took Hagar. And the idea of she took, that should bring to our mind Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. She in this case being Eve, took from the fruit, going back to 16, and gave her to her husband, similar to chapter 3, verse 6, and she gave also to her husband. Now I have to admit that the emphasis here is mine, but those words are being repeated from chapter 3, the fall of man, to chapter 16. Now God never commanded Abraham to do this, to take Hagar as a wife. And I don't believe that you ever see in Scripture God approving of this polygamy. Chapter 21, verse 12, God refers to Hagar as your maid. God has referred to Sarah as Abraham's wife. He never refers to Hagar as his wife. Chapter 16 is a misuse of Abraham's body. It's a misuse of sex, and it's a misuse of procreation. The way God meant for Abraham's body to be used, the way God meant for sex to be used, and what God intended for procreation. In some cases, the Bible is descriptive and not prescriptive. That is to say that the text tells us what did happen, how it happened, what led to it happening. It's not saying that this happened and it was ideal. We've already covered that Jesus even thought about certain commands from God as not being the ideal. For example, the book of Judges. The entire book of Judges is a terrific example of descriptive, not prescriptive, actions by the Israelites. And so chapter 16, I believe, is a descriptive chapter, not a prescriptive chapter. Chapter 17 is another text that should inform us regarding our interpretation of 22. Genesis chapter 17 is the covenant of circumcision, and it can be broken down into verses 1b through 2, that would be the covenant, verses 9 through 14, that circumcision would be the sign. Verses 15 through 21, Sarai's name is going to be changed to Sarah, and the child from Abraham and Sarah, that would be Isaac, is in fact the child of promise. Verse 19 is a rejection of Ishmael as the child of promise. Now, it's not a total rejection of Ishmael, but it is a rejection of Ishmael as the child of promise. And that's very important because God is also rejecting human attempts to bring about God's promises. Chapter 16 is just that. Man, human, has decided that they have to bring about God's promises. And in so doing, you have polygamy. In so doing, you have the birth of Ishmael. And in so doing, you have human attempt to force God's promise. And here is God's rejection of that force. And then verses 22 through 27 would be the actual circumcision. Notice that the sign of the Abrahamic covenant was put on a specific part of Abraham. That is his progenitive part, his part for procreation. Abraham's body, then, his entire body, was, after being submitted to the sign, was then in full submission to God. Now, when we interpret a text, I think it's very important to interpret what does the text actually say. And I don't believe it's appropriate to force other interpretations onto the text that aren't warranted by the text. Now, for example, there have been people who have ever taught or said or proposed that God gave circumcision for hygienic reasons. Well, first of all, that would, of course, assume that circumcision provides hygienic benefits. Now, that unto itself, that assumption, is incredibly culturally biased. And in fact, only in the West, and in fact pretty much only the U.S., actually has that cultural bias. We have other countries, first world countries today, that don't see hygienic benefit in circumcision. Moreover, these supposed benefits of circumcision have never been proven in randomized trials. Now, the reason they've never been proven in randomized trials should be evident. That would be highly unethical. But the point is that any hygienic benefit of circumcision comes from a post hoc argument. And a post hoc argument confuses correlation with causation. And therefore, I don't believe that we can make the assumption, just as humans, first of all, that circumcision provides hygienic benefit. Now, then taking that circumcision would provide hygienic benefit, and putting that onto the text, there's nothing in the text, neither in this specific text nor in later texts, that I believe you can build the case that God is concerned with hygiene when it comes to the sign of the Abrahamic covenant. I don't believe we are warranted in superimposing modern ideas onto ancient texts. That would drive us very close to the fallacy of chronological snobbery. That is, we are so enlightened, which is related to enlightenment fallacy also, and therefore because we have this enlightenment, we can impose that on ancient texts. Moreover, I don't believe that it's a good assumption to assume what we today in 21st century America understand to be the medical procedure of circumcision to be identical with ancient Near Eastern circumcision. What we understand about ancient Near Eastern circumcision is that it took a lot less skin off than modern Kellogg's circumcision. The data that we have only suggests that during the Maccabean period, that would be around 160 BC, so later half of the 2nd century BC, that the Hebrew word pariha, and I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, pariha, was used, and that was used as a combat of the epispasm that some Jews were doing in order to hide their circumcision mark during the Hellenistic period. Pariha would literally be translating to lay the gland bare, which would be, according to Wikipedia, and I have to confess my ignorance here, I'm going to assume that Wikipedia is right, pariha would be equivalent to whatever a low and tight circumcision would be. This again happened during the Bar Kokhba period, so the early part of the 2nd century AD. But these are the only times in Jewish history that we have documentation to suggest that pariha was the mode of circumcision, and other times it does seem that Jewish circumcision was much closer to what we understand to just be the common ancient Near Eastern circumcision, which again took a lot less skin off. So, getting back to Genesis chapter 17, the covenant of circumcision, and it's after Genesis chapter 17, God brings about His purposes in Abraham and in Sarah. This is very important as we get into then chapters 21 and 22. Again, the author of the narratives assumes that we have read all of the important parts of the text up to this point, and that we have followed the story. 22 is part of the Abrahamic narrative, and again, it's bad exegy, it's bad Bible interpretation to try and divorce chapter 22 from the rest of the Abrahamic story. Now, chapters 21 and 22 obviously come in that order, 21 and 22. And you have to see textual links going on in how 21 is told and then how 22 is told. You have quite a bit of overlap going on. Genesis chapter 21, you see that Abraham is required to give up a son, and in 22, he is required to give up a son. In 21, the son, that would be Ishmael, by the way, Ishmael almost dies. In 22, Isaac almost dies. In 21, an angel calls from heaven. In 22, an angel calls from heaven. In 21, Hagar sees the well, that is the well that has water so that Ishmael and her do not die. And in 22, Abraham sees the ram caught by his horns in a thicket. And so, there are these textual links that you have to see. And when you see them, they have to inform your interpretation of 22. Now, the actual text of 22, you have to see that verse 1 begins with God tested Abraham. In modern translations, I wouldn't be surprised if you get a bracket and spoiler alert, closed bracket, coming up, because that's what the author has just done. The author tells you as you begin the text of 22 that what is about to happen is a test from the Lord. Now, as to assuming that Abraham failed the test, which is some people's interpretation, that because he was willing to do this, he somehow failed the test. I don't believe that that interpretation is warranted once again from the text. Verse 2, now take your son, your only son, whom you love. Now, it's interesting that there's that threefold identification of who we're talking about. Take your son, 1, your only son, 2, whom you love, 3. Now, this same threefold thing has already happened in 12 verse 1. Remember, I told you that the entire Abraham story has to inform you. And 12:1 begins with, go forth from your country, 1, from your relatives, 2, and from your father's house, 3. So that same threefold thing is going on. Moreover, here in 22, go to the land of Moroni, whereas back in chapter 12 he was told, go to the land that I will show you. Now, to this point, Abraham has already seen God's provision. God has blessed him since Haran. God has provided him with the child of promise, and God has provided for Ishmael. Those factors are in Abraham's mind as he responds to God's test. Another thing that you cannot miss, you can't miss this as we progress to the test, is Abraham knew that it was through Isaac that the nations would be blessed. He knew from God's own mouth that Isaac was the child of promise. And I think that informs us then in verse 5. Genesis chapter 22, verse 5. In the NIV, Abraham says to his 2 servants who have gone with him, we will worship, and then we will come back to you. So he's telling the 2 young servants that went with him that you 2 are going to stay here, and me and the child, and you can see that in the English Standard Version or in the NASB, I and the boy, or I and the lad, we will go over there. It's possible he pointed at this point. And we will come back to you. We will worship and then return to you. We will come back to you. Has Abraham already figured out by this point that this is a test? He already has faith that he and the lad, are going to return from this. Now, the author of Hebrews understood this to be that Abraham assumed that God could raise the dead. He knows that Isaac is the child of promise. He knows that he's been commanded by God to sacrifice Isaac, and therefore, according to the author of Hebrews, it's logical for him to assume that God will somehow bring Isaac back from the dead. And that is why he could say to his 2 young men that we will come back to you. The point is, Genesis chapter 22 is part of a larger narrative. It needs to be read and it needs to be investigated in the context that it has been read or that it was told in. Moreover, we do have to consider the patriarchal question. Who is this God? How do we understand? How do we interact with Him? And that's something that you see in the life of Abraham. That's something that you see in the life of Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. We've been called by this God. Who is He? How do you interact with Him? How does it work to have a relationship with this God? What about, keeping in mind that Abraham came out of Mesopotamia, what about human sacrifice in Mesopotamia? There is evidence that human sacrifice happened in ancient Mesopotamia. Some evidence that human sacrifice happened on large scales. Some royal people had handmaidens and warriors put to death. Mesopotamia is not alone. Assyria practiced it through the first millennia BC, and many others practiced it from ancient times. God's command to Abraham, did Abraham grow up in a culture and in a time where human sacrifice was a part of worshiping the deity or the deities? And when God called him to do this, did he, based on his cultural upbringing, based on what he saw as the norm, did he see this as a norm? And you've got to see that God stopped the sacrifice. Chapter 22, verse 12. God stopped the sacrifice. Was God saying to Abraham, you think of worshiping God in this way? It's normal for you to think of human sacrifice as being part of worship. I have to stop you and I have to show you that is not the way to worship me. And in fact, later, when God gives the law, Deuteronomy and Leviticus to Moses, this human sacrifice is specifically forbidden. It's specifically forbidden and it's specifically related to the way the Canaanites worship their gods. And we'll come back to that here on our, not in this next section. We're going to get into Noah's flood, but we'll come back to this when we get into the conquest of Canaan, and it will unfortunately pop up again in Israelite history. Noah's flood. Now, our question that we began with had to do with how can you believe in a loving, caring, merciful God, a God who would send His own Son for your salvation? And how can that God that you believe in, that's loving and merciful and so forth, be the same God that would send a flood that would wipe out all but 8 people in the human race? Now, our question is not, was the flood a global or a local flood? Is the flood literal or metaphorical? Those are great questions. Those are questions to track down and to explore. I think I would love to encourage you. I do believe that for our purposes in answering our question, we have to go with the natural read of the text. And the natural read of the text would be literal. It would suggest that it's a global flood, and it would suggest that it did in fact wipe out all but 8 members of the human race. Yes, proper interpretation is necessary for proper understanding. I have just argued all relevant texts need to inform us when we talk about Abraham and Isaac, and therefore I'm not giving you the answer that you have to accept. I encourage you to continue to explore. Was Noah's flood a global event? Did it literally flood the entire world as we understand the entire globe? Did it literally wipe out all but 8 members of the human race? For our purposes, we're going to assume the answer is yes. I am not teaching that as the assumption that all people at all times and so forth have to make. Now, before we go any further, I would like to ask some philosophical questions. These are questions that may be difficult and hard for us to think about, and I think it's something we have to wrestle with. How does love and justice coexist? We know what love is. We know what justice is, especially when we see injustice. When we identify what injustice is, that helps us to clarify what justice would be, right? So what exactly is the relationship between love and justice? Can retribution be loving? Retribution? Is retribution part of justice? And if it is part of justice, can it coexist with love? What is the relationship then between love and retribution? Can justice exist without retribution? Again, we know what injustice is. The world is full of cases of injustice. And when you hear about cases of injustice, your blood might boil. But can justice exist without some form of retribution? Now, another philosophical question is, can God kill a person? If God kills a person, is that the same as us killing a person? God exists in some other way. In fact, one way to define God would be other. We exist here in a temporal state. We are not infinite, we are finite. We exist in some form of a biological sense, that is, we undergo biological processes. Those biological processes begin from the moment that a sperm cell meets an egg cell. It's unique at that point that a biological process has begun, and one day that biological process will also cease. And that is what we understand to be human life. God exists as the other. He exists somehow as something that's not necessarily biological. He exists as something that is outside of what we understand to be biology. If God commands us not to murder, is He under that same obligation? If we define murder as a willful act to kill somebody, is God somehow under that command also, or is He free from that command? Now, when we consider Noah's flood, that is the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament, Jesus uses Noah's flood as an example, as an illustration for what will happen at His second coming. That would be found in Matthew chapter 24. So, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Jesus also sees Noah's flood and what happened in Noah's flood as an illustration as to what will happen at His second coming. Therefore, I think we again see the case that the God of the Old Testament is still the God of the New Testament. Peter also uses the flood as an illustration of past judgment and refers to it in reference to future judgment. So once again, the Jesus message, the love your neighbor as you love yourself, the love God, love others message, both from the founder, that would be Jesus, and from the first followers, here we have Peter, understood the flood, a tragic, horrible thing sent by God, as something that can be compared to something that is going to happen in the future, separating believers from unbelievers. Now, a question would be reasonable, would be, is it always wrong to kill a person? Now here, I do have to give credit to where credit is due. These examples come from Dr. Paul Copen. I believe I'm pronouncing his name right. Now, in an ectopic pregnancy, an ectopic pregnancy is where a fertilized egg, that is, the sperm cell and the egg cell, have met, they are combined, and what we have is a fertilized egg. Therefore, like I just previously said, an example of biology has already happened. An ectopic pregnancy is where a fertilized egg has implanted itself outside of the uterus. That would be in the fallopian tubes, for example. Now, I've tried to stress that I absolutely believe in the sanctity of life and that life begins at the moment of conception. I don't believe that that's a religious stance. I don't believe we can point to a biblical text that tells us that life begins at conception. I believe we can point to scientific journals, scientific books, not interested in theology, but interested in fetal development, interested in embryonic development, that they, from a secular source, identify the moment of life begins at conception. And so I believe that a fertilized egg is, in fact, a human life. But that implantation outside of the uterus makes it so that human life will not survive. It cannot survive. And if nothing is done about it, then the mother will also die. So here we find ourselves with a dilemma. An innocent human life, through some form of biological accident, is not in a place where it will survive. And if it is left, then the mother will also die. We face a hard topic there. We face something that is not an easy answer, especially for somebody who is against the termination of life, especially against the termination of fetal life and embryonic life. So what do we do in this case? Flight 93, on September 11th, four Islamic hijackers hijacked the plane, Flight 93. There were 37 passengers. There were 7 crew members on that plane. And before it crashed into that Pennsylvania field, the White House authorized that plane to be shot down. The other planes had already flown into the North Tower and into the South Tower. 9/11 was already in effect. It was already happening. And here, another plane was headed towards a target. And you look at this, 37 passengers, 7 crew members. We could consider these people, as far as trying to do this horrific, horrible thing on 9/11, we can consider them innocent. They're not a part of that. These 4 Islamic hijackers are the culprits. They're the evil that is doing this. And yet the White House gives the order, the authorization to shoot the plane down, knowing that that means those 37 passengers and 7 crew members are also going to die. Is it always wrong to kill a person? Let us say that you are a witness to one person who can maim or kill another person. You can stop this action with the use of deadly force. Would you be wrong to respond with deadly force? And would you be wrong to not respond and to allow the maiming or killing of a victim? In this case, we assume that one person is doing the evil, the other person is innocent. Regardless, you have the ability to stop this killing or maiming, and you have deadly force as your option. Are you in the wrong to kill somebody who's about to kill somebody else? What do we know about the pre-flood world? Well, we don't have a great deal of details. I realize some people have tried to interpret what the pre-flood world might have been like. I think there you're building arguments from silence. I do think, though, we do get some information from the Genesis text. Genesis chapter 6, verse 2. The language says that the sons of God saw the beauty and took from the daughters of men. That would be the same language we saw in Genesis. That should be Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, regarding the fall. So here, whoever the sons of God are, they have looked, they have saw, and they have taken. And it's the same language that we saw earlier. And that's something that we should understand. The Lord saw, verse 5, the Lord saw, reminiscent of Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis chapter 1, the Lord saw what He had created and it was good. Here, chapter 6, verse 5, the Lord saw, and He sees that the wickedness of man was great. And He saw that the intention of the heart was only continuous evil. What was God's response to that? Chapter 6, verse 6, the Lord was sorry and was grieved in His heart. Now, I want to ask you, when we look at wickedness done by humans, for example, I would call the Holocaust, I would call 9/11, I would call war crimes, and I would call other atrocities wickedness. What is our reaction to wickedness done by people? Evil intentions of people's hearts. I think we have modern examples of this also. H.H. Holmes and the murder castle, the murder of Sylvania Likens, Jeffrey Dahmer, Ariel Castro kidnapping, and many, 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 many others, which are examples of examples of evil intentions in human hearts. And what is our reaction? Is it not like God's reaction there? Chapter 6, verses 11 through 12, the earth was corrupt, filled with violence. Violence can also be translated injustice. God looked upon the earth. It was corrupt. All flesh had corrupted itself upon the earth. How could a loving, caring, merciful God not act in this case? I want you to imagine that time travel is possible and you were able to go back to Austria-Hungary in 1886. Would you kill baby Hitler? Assuming that time travel was possible, assuming all things would progress normally, you have the opportunity to kill baby Hitler. You have the opportunity to kill baby Hitler before baby Hitler becomes adult Hitler. You know what adult Hitler is going to be. You know what he is going to do. You have the opportunity to kill baby Hitler. Do you take it? Do you do it? Today we have ISIS training camps in the Middle East. And just last month, when that terrorist leader of ISIS was taken out, unfortunately children also died. Children also died in that. He blew up, he had a suicide bomb on and he killed himself and his children. We have, as the U.S. that is to say, we have done the same thing to other terrorist training camps and so forth, that we have known in doing this, we are going to take out young, and when we say young, assumingly innocent lives. And we still choose to take out these ISIS and other terrorist training camps. It's not an easy question. It's not a happy question, but it is a real thing. Now, when children are left in less than ideal, and that's an understatement there, when children are left in abusive situations, those innocent children grow up. Do those innocent children who have seen horror, who have seen and been trained to do certain things, evil, wicked things, do they remain innocent? Do they adapt? Do they become the evil that they grew up with? If we didn't take out these ISIS children in these ISIS training camps, what's going to happen years from now? the conquest of Canaan. Now, there's the accusation that this is an example of genocide, or that it's an example of ethnic cleansing. Now, here I want to break people into three groups. I want to break, first of all, the questioner. I want to break them off, and this is just somebody who wants to know, is this genocide? Is this ethnic cleansing? And then I want to break off from the audience another group, group two. This would be the believer. And this would be the believer asking this question: does the conquest of Canaan constitute genocide, constitute ethnic cleansing? And then that final group, the skeptic, the critic, and especially their accusation. They're not asking at that point, they're accusing the text of being genocidal and ethnic cleansing. Now, those first two groups, the questioner and the believer, trying to understand this. Here we can go into some details. Here we can answer that question. However, to the critic, to the accuser, you are embarrassing yourself. And I will get into why you are embarrassing yourself. Once again, we have to allow all the relevant texts to speak. If you don't allow all the relevant texts to speak, we run the risk of the Igor effect, right? Genesis chapter 12 verse 3b, God is speaking here to Abraham, and to you, Abraham, and all of the families of the earth shall be blessed. So through this covenant that God is making with Abraham, all of the families of the earth shall be blessed. When the covenant is re-ratified, chapter 15 verse 7, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. To give you this land to possess it. So at this point, Abraham and his company are in the Levant. God has said, I, the Lord of all the earth, am giving you this land, and giving this land to your descendants. Now, in this very chapter 15, verse 16, in Abraham's day, the sin of the Amorites was not yet complete. They had not reached a point yet where God was willing and ready to judge them. And this kind of idea matches what we see in other parts of Scripture. For example, Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 23. God asks, do I have pleasure in the death of the wicked, declares the Lord God? Rather, that he should turn from his ways and live. You see, even in the Old Testament, a God who is willing to meet people. He doesn't smite them on their first offense. He gives them time. Remember Nineveh? Remember how God was not ready to judge them, and in order to judge them, He sent Jonah to preach to them? He was giving them a warning. And in Abraham's day, despite the fact that God was giving Abraham and his descendants the land, the Amorites were not yet ready to be judged. God had not gotten to that point. Now, something that the critic often overlooks, which I don't think is fair, is the actual command. The actual command given in Deuteronomy. This is given to Moses to give to the children of Israel. Chapter 9, verse 5. It is not for your righteousness or for your uprightness of heart that you are going to possess the land, but it is because of the wickedness that the Lord your God is going to drive them out before you, in order to confirm the oath that the Lord swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is very important if we're going to understand the text. That God was not driving out the Canaanite because the Israelite was so much better. His heart was so much more upright. It was because of their wickedness that the Lord was doing this, and in order to fulfill the the covenant that He had given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You also cannot ignore you also cannot ignore that part about the Lord your God is going to drive them out before you. The Lord your God is going to send His hornet, in other cases, in other texts, that God is saying He's going to drive out the Canaanite before the Israelite. Now, Leviticus chapter 18, verse 25, the land was defiled by its inhabitants. God describes the land of Canaan as being defiled by its inhabitants. We should then ask the question, why or how was the land defiled by the Canaanites? Was it because they weren't keeping Sabbath? Was it because they were eating pigs? Was it because they weren't circumcising their sons? No. No, the Bible does not say that God brought judgment upon the Canaanites because of violations like the Sabbath, which was given to Israel, like kosher laws, which was given to Israel, and like circumcision, which was given to Israel. Those commands were not given to all people at all times. They weren't given to the Canaanites, and God is not judging them for those reasons. So why is God judging them? Well, I brought up earlier wickedness done by humans. I brought up the Holocaust, I brought up 9/11, I brought up war crimes, I brought up other atrocities, evil intentions of the hearts. Now, do these people, the people who perpetrated the Holocaust, the people who perpetrated 9/11, war criminals, atrocities, H.H. Holmes, the lady who murdered Sylvania Likeness, Jeffrey Dahmer, Ariel Castro, do they deserve to be prosecuted, arrested and prosecuted and punished because they weren't keeping the Sabbath, they weren't keeping kosher, they weren't circumcising? No. No. That is not why these people deserve to be judged. That's not why we, you and I, standing here today, look at cases of wickedness and cases of evil, that we want people arrested, that we want people punished. Well, is it because they don't believe in Jesus? Is it because they don't do baptism? Is it because they don't do communion that you and I want them punished? No. We want them punished because of those atrocities. We want them punished because of the wickedness and their evil intentions. The land was defiled by its inhabitants. Who and what were the inhabitants doing? Their practices. Child sacrifices to their gods, incest, homosexuality, bestiality, and other sexual perversions. Do we have extra biblical sources on these practices done by the Canaanites? Yes, we do. I believe I'm pronouncing this right, Ugaritic texts, which are actually Canaanite texts from this time period, they affirm that there was child sacrifice going on in Canaanite society. There was incest, there was homosexuality, there was bestiality, and there were other sexual perversions. So I want you to pretend that today you hear about a religious group in the area, let's just say the Western Slope. And it's not only just hearsay, it's provable that this religious group is engaging in child sacrifice, that they are engaging in illegal sexual practices. Would you call the cops and want them arrested because they're not keeping the Sabbath, they're not keeping kosher, or they're not circumcising their sons? No, you would never call the cops on this religious group who are doing these horrific things and tell them that they're not keeping the Sabbath, they're not keeping kosher, and they're not circumcising. Of course, those would be Old Testament commands. So would you today call up the cops about this religious group and say that this group is not believing in Jesus, they're not baptizing, they're not taking communion? No, of course not. If there was a religious group here on the Western Slope that was engaging in child sacrifice to their God and engaging in illegal sexual practices, we would want them prosecuted because of that. And that's why God is judging the Canaanites. And you have to read the invasion of Canaan and the conquest of Canaan. You have to read it in the context of the Bible. But you also have to notice that the Israelites were given this exact same thing. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 28, if the Israelites defiled the land the way the Canaanites did, the land would spew them out. God has told the Israelites, you don't get the land because you're upright. You don't get the land because your heart is good. You get the land because of their wickedness. And because I made the promise to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And if, once you go into the land of Canaan, you begin to practice the practices of the Canaanites, child sacrifice and all this sexual immorality and so forth, then I too am going to drive you out of the land. And this is exactly what happens. 2 Kings chapter 17, the northern kingdom of Israel goes into captivity. They go into captivity because they began to live like the Canaanites. They began to worship like the Canaanites. They began to do things like the Canaanites. And unfortunately, Judah only holds on a little bit longer. 2 Kings chapter 25, God judges Israel. He judges Israel for that same thing that he judged the Canaanites for. Is this a case of ethnic cleansing? Well, considering that Israel was Semitic and that the Canaanites were Semitic, they're the same ethnicity. We're not talking about two distinct ethnicities. In fact, Hebrew and Canaanite languages are related. They're all related to Phoenician because they're all Semitic. Canaanites could actually join Israelites. Caleb of Caleb and Joshua is the son of Jehunah, the Kenizzite. Genesis chapter 15 verse 9, Israel was supposed to depose the the Kenizzites. So Joshua was not an Israelite. He was a Canaanite. And yet, he gave up his Canaanite heritage, he gave up his Canaanite ways, and he joined Israel. The same thing with Rahab. Rahab was a Canaanite. Rahab was in the land. Rahab had heard the rumors about what the God of Israel had done to the Egyptians and what he had done to bring the children of Israel out and what he had done through the wilderness for them. And she saw that I'm on the losing team, so I'm going to join the winning team. And you could do that. You could be a Canaanite and you could join the Israelites as long as you're willing to give up your gods and practice the Israelite religion. Is this a case of genocide? In saying that this is a case of genocide, you once again have to ignore several biblical texts. Is it a good idea when you're trying to interpret the Bible to ignore relevant texts? That's one thing I've been trying to drive home in this, is that all the relevant texts need to be able to speak to the issues that we're dealing with. And the Lord, Yahweh, said that He was going to drive out the Canaanites. You can see this several places in Exodus. And the Lord would enable Israel to drive them out. Deuteronomy chapter 9 and other places. Here the Lord is saying to drive them out, to dispossess them. It's not carte blanche, go in and kill everybody. It's, I will drive them out of the land. I am giving you the land, and I am going to drive these people out of the land so that you can occupy the land. So, no. This is not a case of ethnic cleansing, and this is not a case of genocide when you let all of the biblical text speak to the issue that we're dealing with. Thank you. Hey all, Pastor Ozzy here. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you found it helpful, feel free to share it. And if you want more, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and you'll be notified when new videos are available. Again, thank you so much.